Rankings reveal. The Fantasy Ruckers are back from our 2-week fantasy rugby retreat. We took the time to crunch the numbers, and we got some juicy fantasy MLR rankings to reveal to you over the coming weeks. On this week's episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show, we kick it all off with an in-depth look into the top 10 overall fantasy MLR players from the 2023 season. And from the upcoming collegiate draft to a team on the move, there's also no shortage of news to catch up on from around the league. The Fantasy Rucker Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 75 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. And we're back. It was a 2-week break. I'm Ryan Yee. With me, as always, Matt Yee, Devin Vanderpool, and guys, I missed you. Obviously, the fantasy grind never stopped. We were off away doing crunching the numbers and putting together some solid off-season content for our listeners. But hey, good to be back on the show here with you guys.
Oh yeah, it's good to be back. It's nice to be back with the boys. It seems like a month's worth of things happened in the past 2 weeks, so we got a lot to cover here.
No kidding. Yeah, we got a whole bunch to get through, obviously. Yeah, over the past 2 weeks that we've been away, it feels like there's just been a whole bunch of news and notes that has dropped, which we're going to get all to. Definitely no shortage of big things either. It's some pretty big news that has happened over the past couple of weeks. And hey, like we said, the fantasy off-season content starts now, and we're starting with our fantasy rankings reveal, how the 2023 season finished with all the players there. We're going to go through the top 10, all of the different positions, go through our top 5, compare that top 5 to our predictions that we had at the start of the season, see how off that we were. But yeah, we start off today's show with a top 10 reveal. We're going to talk to you and break down and give an in-depth look into the top 10 fantasy players from the 2023 season, break that all down, and then hey, compare it to what it was like in the 2022 season, which I think is going to bring up some pretty interesting nuggets. But hey, before we get into any of that, make sure you're following us on social media. All the handles are up there above on the YouTube video, in the description if you're listening to on the podcast. Yeah, Instagram, YouTube, and now X.
I was hoping you were gonna say Twitter, man.
I know. We got to change that up. It's
That's
now
right.
X. It's gonna take a while.
I thought you were gonna slip up after 2 years of saying Twitter.
And I mean, I haven't changed the logo up there because I'm still at heart all aboard the Twitter train. But we'll see how.
I love the little birdie.
I love the little birdie, but we'll see. We're going there. But yeah, at the Fantasy Ruckers, all great content there. And as we get through this off season, just gonna be a whole bunch of fantasy content for you guys. And of course, we are still trying to make fantasy rugby a reality for the masses, and that's where you're gonna hear it there first. So make sure you're following us, and you'll get that all in the know there. We also have a Discord channel with a great community there that you can join, talk a little bit of rugby as well. And we do have a website, fantasyruckers.com. If you want to dive back into some of the numbers from the 2023 season, we have that all there, and that's where all of the content moving forward will be in terms of fantasy stats.
Yeah, I caught some random guy on Reddit sourcing our website for stats.
That's true. I did see that as well. We're now
source Fantasy Ruckers.
Really?
We're now considered a reliable source, guys.
Oh, really? It's Jam Delay. That's the source.
Oh, wow. Appreciate it.
All right. Well,
you just put it on a website.
Now that we got all the housekeeping out of the way, we got to get right into it because there's a whole bunch that we got to cover in this episode. And I don't know where to begin with this because, again, just a whole bunch of news dropping over the past 2 weeks while we've been away. But let's start here. Let's start with looks like a team is going to be on the move. We thought we could possibly get out of LA, but it sounds like we might be returning back sometime soon. And it happens to be Rugby Atlanta that has been acquired and will relocate based on an announcement from the new owner or an announcement from the ownership group is expected. Interesting stuff. Obviously, kind of how this all, before we kind of dive into it, how it all kind of played out. Rugby Atlanta, obviously, chairman and majority owner Marcus Calloway passed away in 2021. An investment group came in and acquired control of the franchise on an interim basis, which is interesting because they went through that whole questionable rebrand last season as well. Kind of interesting that that went through. But then now a new permanent ownership group has stepped up, and it sounds like that with this new ownership group, that Rugby Atlanta will be on the move. And according to sources, Brian Ray has come out that he's hearing that the team is moving to Los Angeles, like I mentioned. Yeah, very tough for Rugby Atlanta fans. Your opinion, guys, on this this big time move here for Rugby Atlanta?
I mean, it's just I didn't really see this one coming because, Rugby Atlanta's kind of been a staple of this league. And you think about all those years back of, even when Toronto was playing out of like Life University or wherever, they're playing out of Georgia. Rugby Atlanta has kind of just always been part of the MLR. And yeah, it seems weird for them to no longer be a part of it, but it is what it is. Ownership's got to go make money in LA, I guess. And yeah, you've got to feel for some of the players though.
Yeah, most definitely. And speaking of the players, I mean, the United States Rugby's Player Association came out with an open letter to Nick Benson, CEO, and Bill Gorin, Vice Commissioner of Major League Rugby, basically outlining the fact that, hey, if this is happening, we need to make sure that this process is transparent, fair, and equitable for some of these players, based of relocation when it comes to contracts, benefits, workers' compensation. So obviously taking notice there to make sure the players are best in mind, like you mentioned, Matt. But it's interesting.
I mean, the letters are all good, but it seems like the MLR and old Nick Benson over there is literally looking at these letters and tossing them in the trash. Because, I mean, the players union was trying to formalize. They were trying to be recognized by the MLR. They go to the labor union. They try to get recognized through the labor union so that they have to go to court or something like that. Doesn't happen. Now they're trying to send letters to Nick. I'm pretty sure that Nick Benson is just taking these letters, scribbling all over them, using them as scratch paper at this point. Because, I mean, he hasn't even responded. And, they just keep continuing to do things that would be against what a players union would want. So it's just, I mean, who cares about the players union? Clearly, that's what the MLR is saying. But yeah, I mean, you got to feel for the players. But, I mean, when I'm thinking about, fantasy impact, rugby, Atlanta is not going to draw stars. Atlanta is not going to draw people from overseas. You know what is going to draw people from overseas? Oh, yeah. Living in LA. Time.
And it's kind of funny, 2 off seasons in a row. Well, not funny. I shouldn't use the word funny, but 2 off seasons in a row, these players just kind of treated like mushrooms, right? Fed crap and kept in the dark.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but look, maybe this is good for the MLR. We've seen the pull that San Diego has been getting and what they've been doing over there. Maybe they can do the same in LA, although they're competing with a lot of sports over there. But hopefully they can pull in some talent and kind of help the MLR grow with this move. It's not confirmed, but
just living in LA though,
What will be very interesting though is kind of obviously there's gonna be a whole bunch of parallels because yes, the Major League Rugby had a team once in Los Angeles.
I hope they come up with a better
too long
name.
ago. Yeah, it's gonna be funny. I mean, the comparisons are gonna be there. It's gonna be what's gonna be the next name. It'll be interesting to see where they play. I'd imagine that the likelihood that and again, this is just all conjecture, but the likelihood that they'll be back at LA Coliseum, I'm not too sure. Obviously, that was a big draw. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see the branding. And again, none of this is confirmed yet. This is all according to Brian Ray, who says he's hearing it is going to be Los Angeles. But hey, Rugby Atlanta is no more. And I have been quoted with saying this too, because before this crazy rebrand that they had, which again, like I mentioned, was very, very interesting and especially with an interim group to kind of make that drastic change, and then all of a sudden now there's a new ownership group that's completely changing. Why even make the rebrand in the first place? Rattle was one of my favorite branding schemes in across the whole. It just fits so perfect with the snake in their logo, the red and black there. It was pretty cool stuff. But I guess that'll all be no more. There will be a to be named Los Angeles team apparently that will be joining the MLR sometime shortly here.
Giltini's 2.0.
Yeah, Giltini's 2.0, and they'll probably go bankrupt 2.0 too. But
The
But
Gilbrewskis.
hey, Vandy, Utah Warriors over there, they're sitting strong as the one of two remaining black and red colored teams. How does that feel?
The
That must
Bible
feel
Belt,
pretty
baby.
good. Hey, you guys got rid of one. Now you just got to get rid of San Diego, and then you guys are the final remaining black and white team, black and red team.
Yeah, not too sure if you're going to be getting rid.
We
of
eliminate those teams and we hold the shield. That's the trick. That's the trick.
Pretty far away, bud.
Yeah, San Diego's a little bit closer than that. But yeah, should be interesting to see how that all develops. But right now, we'll see. But yeah, Rugby Atlanta is relocating to a new destination after an acquisition from a new ownership group. All right, well, let's now move on here. Speaking of brand new teams in Major League Rugby, a team that has now started to formulate their club and their roster. The Miami Sharks going through their MLR expansion draft, selecting 25 players at the end of July there, and some pretty decent names moving in the expansion draft. Some names to kind of go over that are of note. Liam Hallam-Ames from Nola Gold. Matt, you were really high on him. He moves on over to the Miami Sharks.
Nobody's moved over. They've drafted them, and they had until I think yesterday or maybe 2 days ago, but the start of this week to actually sign them.
Yeah.
And to actually come to an agreement. So it was the same kind of thing with the whole Chicago Hounds thing, is that they have some time to have to come to some sort of agreement. None of these players actually have to sign for this team, which is, again, what the heck's the point of the expansion draft? But, none of them actually have to do anything.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, if an agreement is not signed, then the players are returned to their original team. That is kind of interesting. So it's like, hey, imagine if you were able to do that.
Yo, that's pretty wild, man.
It is pretty crazy. But I guess nonetheless. Anyways, big names moving there. Anyways, that are potentially going to be on the Miami Sharks. Yeah, again, that deadline was Sunday, August 6th. So it'd be interesting to see kind of the names that come out that were able to come away with some of those signings and what this Miami team is going to look like. But yeah, again, pretty interesting stuff here. You got names like Avery Oideman that were on there, Eric Howard, Quinton Newcomer,
Tyler Fisher,
guys, and it's funny enough. I feel like I see kind of Noah Lloyd. He's been on like every single team in Major League Rugby. It sounds like he's also on the move as well.
He's that wily vet.
It's also like weird, like why are they drafting Nick Feeks when he announced his retirement 3 weeks ago? 4 weeks ago. Like, how does that make any sense? What was it? Did New York
to help New York
else,
future
and that's
considerations?
That's all they had left. I mean, it's odd. I think some decisions here, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of similar. It's kind of throwback to the Chicago Hounds expansion draft, except, I think Vandy, you brought up before the show that this one seems like it's less impressive because of the fact that two teams didn't get demolished before.
Yeah, it's true. I mean,
when you have two of the top teams absolutely implode, then there's gonna be a lot of talent on the board there.
Yeah, Chicago obviously the timing worked out for them, but yeah, again, it's completely different. I mean, it did from a competitive standpoint and how 2023 went for the Chicago Hounds. They looked much better on paper at the start of the season than the way they actually performed in 2023. It'll be interesting to see how this Miami Sharks team kind of comes together. But I mean,
and it'll be interesting to see who actually came to an agreement. I mean, if I was a player and I got a chance to play for Miami, I mean,
another nice place to live, man.
Miami's a pretty good life to live. Miami's a pretty good place to live. Much better than Chicago, that's for sure. I mean, much better attraction than Chicago. So, I mean, I think they have a little bit better of a chance when they come out with the list of who's actually came to an agreement of some of these guys.
They just show them the beaches and they're like, all right,
I'll take a year to live in Miami.
That's right.
And I will note that the Miami Sharks have been making signings outside of this expansion draft. So the team is not going to be solely built on whatever players are obviously in this expansion draft. So it'll be interesting to see again as the word comes out in terms of who was actually signed, what this Miami Sharks team is going to look like. It's going to be pretty interesting. And then again, just the rules that went to this expansion draft. Minimum of 5 players were made available from each team. And again, the Miami had until Sunday, August 6th to finalize a deal with them, and the MLR notes that no player is under any obligation to accept Miami's offer, which is
wild
to say the least. Yeah, it kind of interesting how that all plays out. But nonetheless, we'll see how this Miami Sharks team is going to look here as the offseason goes on. And I will say, seeing some of the branding from the Miami Sharks, I am absolutely loving their logo. Loving their logo.
Yeah,
Should be
it
very
looks pretty
interesting.
sweet.
I love their colors as well. So really excited to see what happens with that club. All right, shifting on here, a couple, I would say, interesting stuff before we kind of get into some draft talk here, because obviously that's been a big topic of discussion. Want to just catch up on some roster moves that have gone through. Again, the best place to go for this, and we'll give a huge shout out to James Dealey's MLR stats. He compiles a list every single week of the latest roster moves that are happening every single week. So go check that out. A whole bunch, I think, just to put it kind of a nice little bow over the whole entire thing, is just that there's a whole bunch of people that are moving to the NBC Bunnings Cup. And we've mentioned this a whole bunch of times, Matt, when you and I have been on the show and have talked about this, is that this is not necessarily something to be worried about. Again, this is a league that plays in opposite timing of what the MLR plays, gives these boys some rugby. We talked to Andrew Quatrin 2 weeks ago about how he's training over with an NPC Bunnings Cup side during the offseason just to get a few extra reps in. But I mean, there's big names moving: Jordan Trainer, Luke Campbell, Liam Hallam-Ames, Rob Cobb, Micaiah Torrance-Reed, and then you look at Jordan Chait. Yeah, just a whole bunch of guys that are moving over here. J.L. Relila, Nico Jones, Hamish Dalzell, a whole bunch of names that we can go through. But again, Matt, if you want to just reiterate again, kind of how there is no worry for fantasy owners in this situation. All these players should be back come 2024 here in Major League Rugby.
Yeah, I mean, you said it there. It lands perfectly in the offseason of the MLR, and unless they make it to a Super Rugby team and a Super Rugby squad, then they should be fine to come back, and it shouldn't be too much of a worry or too much of an impact on fantasy. If anything, it should improve as these guys are kind of getting a higher competition and potentially more playing time with the World Cup going on, with a lot of the international guys being out of the country, having a little bit more playing time with them as well, potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's also a very nice graphic made by James Dealey, again, at Jam Delay on Twitter, or excuse me, on X, at MLR Stats on Instagram. He put together just all the different teams in the NPC Bunnings Cup that have players from the MLR. It's a nice, neat little graphic, so you can go check that out on X as well. And then there are a couple, though, moves of note that I do want to mention. We'll get to the big trade that's going to lead into our draft talk here. But the first move that I want to talk about, Ruida Biddle, Jordan Brown moving to the Toronto Arrows for an international slot and 2024 cap considerations. This is an interesting one because Ruida Biddle has been a guy that has been kind of up and down in the fantasy circles. Scored 124.3 fantasy points in this past season for Rugby Atlanta. Started almost every single match for Rugby Atlanta in there. I mean, this is a pretty solid acquisition for the Toronto Arrows here, and getting a pretty solid player both on the pitch and from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that's an unreal acquisition. And you look at this, Ruida Biddle and Jordan Brown, you see them getting traded to, and then you see them lose Shane O'Leary in the expansion draft potentially. So you kind of see that roster spot being filled. But I think the big question, the weirdest thing here is which ownership made this trade?
Yeah, I was just about to ask that.
The one that sold? Was it one that sold them? Was it the one that acquired them?
Like, who does that slot go to? Does Miami retain that international slot?
No, that's not Miami.
Rattle.
Rugby Atlanta.
Rattle to Rugby Atlanta is trading with Toronto Arrows.
Yeah, but Rugby Atlanta doesn't exist.
They're going to LA. They're not Miami.
So I guess.
Oh, LA, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
LA would, I guess, retain that international slot, but still, it's like, did Ruida Biddle know that they were going to be moving, and that's why he got traded? What was going on with this trade? It's kind of interesting just that the timing of this trade goes through, less than a week later, the relocation gets announced. Who the heck made that trade? Like,
hey, I know you guys love Toronto, but imagine almost going to LA and then you move to Toronto.
Yeah, it's interesting though. It's interesting. Again, Los Angeles is not solidified, but I think Toronto got a great player here.
Yeah.
But I mean, look, it's also interesting here because Toronto, they just parted ways with their head coach, Peter Smith, and And I think they're trying to find their identity as well, and being able to get some quality players like Ruud Biddle is really going to help them with that. And when he was playing, and when he was on, and when he was healthy, he was a force to be reckoned with. That's for sure.
Absolutely. And then I want to mention before we get to the other big time move that involved the Toronto Arrows, want to get rid of some other moves here. Ryan Matyas, Dino Waldron, and Danny Barrett all retiring here. Yep. Not really necessarily fantasy relevant. Probably the biggest one out of all that was Danny Barrett. Definitely was historically pretty impactful in fantasy in previous years. Last year, not so much. So it's interesting to see that. And
I mean, Ryan Matyas definitely had his time the past couple of years.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, didn't appear much here for the San Diego and with Ryan Matyas. Only started, I believe, one time this last season, and then you look at Danny Barrett this past season, only 49.3 fantasy points. He started a whole bunch, about half the year, just didn't make the fantasy impact that people expected him to make. But hey, nonetheless, he hangs up the boots, moves on to bigger and better things outside of the steps following his rugby career. And now shifting over to the Dallas Jackals, who have made a whole bunch of moves as well. I just want to get this out of the way. A couple people leaving that did have a whole bunch of fantasy impact. Alejandro Torres, fly half for the Dallas Jackals. He's moving to overseas to play for Castorino Rugby in the Italian Serie A. That is there. Obviously, 19 caps with the Jackals between 2022 2023. He scored 2 tries in that time span, 32 points, which is interesting when we look at his fantasy impact. 60.6 fantasy points, okay, as a fly half. Started every single game this past season for the Dallas Jackals, so he'll definitely be a big shoes to fill there, or an important shoes to fill there in Dallas. And then we also have the big departure of Conrado Rura. He's also going to Italy too, promoted with the newly promoted Rugby Vicenza team over there, and he's a guy that definitely had a whole bunch of fantasy impact, 130.5 fantasy points on this season. Had some pretty big time games. He had 2 matches during the year, over 17 fantasy points, and started every single match except for one during our fantasy season. So another player that kind of had a big impact.
And I mean, speaking of the Dallas Jackals, it also looks like Thomas Caceres, who is drafted. Well, not speaking of Dallas Jackals. I was thinking of Dallas Jackals because Thomas Caceres is South American. I just figured that he would be at the Dallas Jackals, but I guess moving on to the other heavily South American team, or planning to be heavily South American team before we head to the draft rise, just the Miami Sharks. A few signings from them as well. I mean, they're making moves, like you were saying while we were talking about the draft. They signed Roloff Smith from the Curry Cup over in South Africa. I think he had not a cap, but he played with the Springboks against the Barbarians. And then I believe they're coming close to a deal with Thomas Caceres, which is somebody who they drafted in the expansion draft. So, I mean, I guess they have some finalized deals from that expansion draft, which is good to hear. But yeah, I mean, Roloff Smith might be a guy that we're looking at next year at that back row spot as a guy who might make a pretty big fantasy impact for the Miami Sharks.
Caceres was in the expansion draft.
Yes.
He was. Oh, yes, there he's with the New England Free Jacks. Yeah, big one there. So it should be interesting. And then, just want to go back quickly to the Dallas Jackals. Had 2 re-signings there as well. Pedro Imhoff is returning to the Dallas Jackals, and so is their captain, Gerald Gomez-Vara. Both players, not necessarily fantasy impact. Imhoff, he was a guy that you kind of maybe relied on in a pinch for scrum half. Kind of was started games when he was able to, and then Gomez-Vara, again, was pretty impactful, 101.6 fantasy points, started every single match. Not one of the top flight back rowers, but again, he might be a guy that people look at in a pinch here when they're streaming. So yeah, Dallas Jackals quite busy. And then obviously with the expansion draft and the signings there, the Miami Sharks, like Matthew mentioned, very busy as well. All right, want to get to the big time move that I want to talk about here that also involved the Toronto Arrows, and that is their trading of their first round draft pick. They had the 2nd overall draft pick in the season, which I also want to get your guys' opinion on. When you look at the draft order that will be coming, obviously this draft taking place August 17th, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time on Fox Sports 2. Opinions about the Miami Sharks automatically getting the number 1 overall pick because they are the newest expansion team before we kind of get into this?
I mean, it kind of makes sense to me. I mean, when you look at the past expansion teams, they definitely have pretty much been in last place in their first season. So it kind of makes sense to me when you look at the Jackals, when you look at the Hounds.
I mean, obviously, and before though, before obviously Toronto made this big time move, I would have been pissed if I was Toronto if I had that number one overall pick and as bad of a season I had, and all of a sudden you don't that, but maybe not with the situation that obviously.
When you look at the draft class,
sure,
I don't know if you really care if you have the number one pick or not.
Sure. But all right, let's talk about kind of that move. The Houston SaberCats trading away Robbie Povey to the Toronto Arrows for the Arrows' first round draft pick in 2023. That second overall draft pick that we're talking about. Man, the Arrows are making moves, man. This team could look pretty dang good, and obviously dang good in quotations. They're going to look better, it looks like, at least with the players that they have acquired at the start of this offseason. Way better than how they looked this past season. Robbie Povey at the helm at that 10 position. You got Ruida Biddle, a threat on the outside now. Obviously, Toronto needed that scoring threat. You got a solid player in Robbie Povey. Pretty big time move here for the Arrows.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good move for them. Robbie Povey looked good at the end of the season when he was filling in for Davey Coates. So I think it's a good move for them, and I think they clearly need the depth to cover for all the injuries that they're probably going to rack up again this year. So
jeez, man.
So
where's that off? Where's that from?
Beautiful.
Where are you pulling that from?
What do you mean?
Why
half their team was dead this year?
I know. Why is that an automatic next season?
Well, because it happened. Look, fool me once, shame on me, right? Shame on me. No,
fool me won't get fooled again.
Yeah, fool me once, shame on me, all right? Fool me twice, shame on you. That's how the saying goes. Shame on me. Shame on me again. But fool me 3 times.
But what seasons were they injured the season before?
Both of them. They've been injured both seasons. They're half their team at some point during the season were hurt.
Okay. Physical game, man.
Year before, year after. It's just patterns. That's all I'm reading. It's just facts.
You know what? Their conditioning coach is the problem.
Yeah, their physio sponsorship.
That's right.
Figure it out. But getting back to the point. I mean, look, you gave up what I think is, what are you going to get with that first round second pick, right? Like, you look at the draft class here, and yeah, I don't know a lot of players, but I do know that a lot of the good players come from some of the best schools. You know, you look at some of the top guys, the top draft pick that was out of the collegiate draft was Sam Gola. You see how his career went. He came right out of one of the top schools in the U.S., Cal Berkeley, right? You look at other guys who made an impact. You look at Curly, like Owen Rattan, you know, coming out of the UBC. You look at Seth Purdy coming out of Cal Berkeley. These are the guys that got meaningful minutes in the season, and you don't see any. There's nobody from UBC. There's, I think, maybe one guy or no guys from Cal Berkeley. Why would I? That second pick means nothing to me if that guy's not going to get any playing time, but I know Robbie Povey is going to be one of my guys that I'm going to be playing throughout the season.
Sure. No,
so great trade for Toronto.
That's a great point. And let's get into that conversation then, because I think, again, the reason why I saved this move for the last thing before we head into our top 10 breakdown was because of, I don't want to call it controversy, but it's definitely stirring up something when it comes to the MLR collegiate draft. So quoting Brian Ray at Ray's Rugby on X, he says, quote, "The Arrows had the number 2 overall selection in the draft and were very quick to trade it after seeing the declared list. They know who is coming down the Canadian pipeline. That should be very alarming for MLR brass and not just dismissed by the league's CEO." And it is interesting because, again, Matt, like you mentioned, and you look at the draft prospect list that MLR has posted on their website. The big thing that you notice when going through the list is that they're missing a whole bunch of big-time schools. And Brian Ray goes on to expand himself that says according to Nick Benson, who says, "We feel that the best players that are out there in the collegiate system are declaring." Brian Ray comes out to him and says, "Respectfully, I disagree. UBC is the best team in Canada. 0 athletes from UBC declared. Navy beat Cal in the D1A final. 0 from Navy, 1 player from Cal." So interesting there that you're starting to see, yeah, okay, maybe that's not the case. That this draft, the players declaring for this draft aren't among the best in the country here, or in both Canada and the USA, which is interesting. And again, that kind of lends to the whole situation where Toronto Arrows is now not they're willing to trade that second overall pick because they see kind of what's happening, and then it leads to kind of another layer where there are rules to kind of bypass this, where if a player doesn't declare for the draft, yes, they need to sit out that first season, but then they're open to signing with whatever team that they would like to, if I understand the rules correctly. I'm pretty sure that's the way it goes. So maybe there's a loophole there that the Toronto Arrows, and I'm not saying that they are, but there are rumors going around that, or there are inklings going around that, hey, there are maybe, Arrows are seeing that there are other players in the Canadian pipeline. If they just wait a little bit instead of declaring for the draft, there's a pathway there for them to go to the Arrows. And they can require that talent without needing the collegiate draft. And when you have something like that, it's going to cause a little bit of issues, because again, teams are not building through the draft here. It's going to minimize the worth or the value that the draft has. And again, teams finishing last who get that top draft pick, like Matthew kind of alluded to there, it's not going to really matter. It's not a big deal that the Miami Sharks got the first overall pick over the Toronto Arrows. Because imagine, Danny, you would think in your head, like if you think about the NHL, the NBA, or any of the big time sports, most recently the NHL expanding with their teams. Imagine if the team who won the draft lottery automatically got the second pick, and the Vegas Golden Knights or the Seattle Kraken automatically got the first pick. There would be a crazy uproar. You know what I mean? Because the value of the draft is so much higher. But in this case, because there's these kind of differing rules and ways to kind of bypass the draft, and it's tougher in rugby, I understand. There's a whole bunch of more overseas movement and things like that. But it's definitely interesting there.
I was just about to say, I feel like because of the movement and everything in rugby, it almost makes it tough to have a draft, and a draft that makes it like a proprietary thing that you want to have. Because, alluding to hockey, a first overall pick could be your future for 15 years. You know what I mean? You draft McDavid, your franchise changes overnight. And I just don't see that happening with the MLR. And with the way it kind of is now.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, Vanny. Like, why are you trying to bring in this draft? One, it's a waste of money. You rent out a steakhouse and a grill for 5 guys to come up and shake Nick Benson's hand across the stage and sit on an interview. And then what? You put that on, you probably have to pay Fox Sports to try and get that on FS2, but who cares? So why do we need this draft?
When you divert that 1 year, is it like an age thing? When you said,
no, it's just, you have to, I think it's once you age out of college.
Yep.
So you graduate.
Yep.
And then you need to just spend 1 year unsigned. That's it. Whenever after you graduate, whenever that is.
Oh, so they've graduated their college.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're
not leaving college. No. Yeah.
So it's similar to football, where you finish your college seasons and then move to the NFL, right? You wouldn't be like a first year student and then you're just dope at rugby and you get drafted right away.
No.
You finish your term.
Unless you ended up leaving. You ended up leaving school, right?
I got you. Yep.
You can leave school if you really want to, but to that point of
that's a crazy loophole.
Yeah. But it just makes more of a case of why the draft just doesn't make sense to this league. You're trying to fix something that isn't broke. You look at every league around the world, there is no draft. Well, you build through academies, you build through getting guys to join your academy. You build from building youth all the way down to U16, U12, U10s, and you build those academies and build those guys up. And you look at overseas, the way that it helps with their development process. And then you look at the MLR, and it's you don't have the platform of the talent pool to pull from to make the draft meaningful, right? You need to build those guys first. And if these guys, if the Arrows are going to try and do this anyways, which every team has an academy side, but it's just why don't you just use that as your source of players and your source of building talent throughout the league? And that's what the league's for. It's not for, putting on a show at a steakhouse for shaking hands on TV.
Well, I mean, again, we know why they're doing it, right? It's the North American thing.
Yep.
I mean, even the MLS, right? A historically European sport that doesn't in the overseas league doesn't have drafting. They have their own draft. And again, I'm not a big MLS fan and I don't watch it religiously and I don't know the impact that the draft has in that league, but it's kind of parallels in that where, it's incorporating that North American type style that's familiar with American sports fans into a league. But again, with
the MLS
yeah.
Go ahead.
With the you know, the ability for players to skip out on the draft and with the ability for players to acquire players in other ways. It doesn't have to be all through the draft. You can sign guys from overseas. You can sign young guys elsewhere. It just minimizes the importance that this draft has, which is why you're seeing moves like Toronto Arrows. And hey, maybe we see more moves like that in the future just because these teams start to understand, hey, it's maybe not as valuable as we thought it was. There's not going to be Sam Gola's every single draft.
Yeah.
Especially evident in this prospect pool that was released by Major League Rugby.
Yeah, and I mean the only thing that I was going to say is that the MLS has, some of the teams are training kids from under 10s. Like Vancouver Whitecaps, I know has an under 10s program that is training, through the professional facility, and it's just like you have to build that first. That has to be built first for teams to be able to actually develop talent. And the draft, I just think it's just not the right way to go. But
well, I mean, again, I don't think right now teams think that the draft is the way that they're going to build their teams. I think every single team in the MLR completely understands that this draft is not necessarily the most important thing. Like you don't see teams. What do you mean?
I mean, like last year, I would say it was a pretty good draft.
Sure.
Last year, I would say that like when you look at the guys and you look at the impact of what those guys, you look at the year before, you look at the year before that. I mean, Tavit Lopetti, Connor Mooneyhan, these guys are guys who have had a pretty big impact in the league. I think it's this year that we're looking at it now, and it's like,
well, yeah, but again, those aren't. I guess my point being is that those players weren't the players that were winning those teams like that were necessarily they're building their teams around. Like when you look about the other sports, like what Vandy's saying about how one player or how a couple players can change the course of your franchise. That's not what's happening here in rugby. The base of how these teams are going to build their clubs and build their programs is what you're saying, Matt, which I completely agree with, is through their academy sides, through overseas signings and guys that you can bring over. And you supplement that with the draft. Where you may have a guy like Sam Gola come through every once in a while, but then you may have drafts like this where it's slim picking. So again, I don't think it's end all be all. I don't think that again, like agreeing with you, Matt, that you can't build your team through this. But we'll see how it goes. And again, this is the first season. I think why it's such a big topic of discussion is because this is the first season that it's evident that, hey, first, we don't have the talent pool. And just like Brian Ray said, I mean, when you don't have some of the best kids coming from the best schools from across the country, that's a sign in itself. And the Arrows are obviously making that clear by trading out of that second pick and acquiring Robbie Povey, who, like Matt said, is going to have a way bigger impact than whoever they would have picked in that second pick anyway. So it'll be interesting to see how it moves forward.
Hey, on a bright side, Vanny, Utah can draft Mika Cruce's brother. And you guys can have the Cruce missiles on both sides of the field.
That's right, buddy. That's right. But in all fairness, to the MLR, there's bad years even in hockey where, the first round, maybe one guy pans out and is like the 20th overall,
Sure.
In their defense, there's bad years for every draft in every sport.
True.
So I guess we'll see. And then just before we start breaking down this top 10 here, to end on a lighter note here, again, congratulations to the New England Free Jacks for winning the MLR Shield here this past season. And hey, it looks like they're going to get a little bit of recognition here. Thursday night's preseason opener with the Patriots, they're going to be honored during that game. So they get a little bit of a nod on there. And I have a feeling that obviously there are links with the Patriots to the New England Free Jacks and some of the ownership groups. You had Nate Ebner, who's a part owner there, that was a Patriots player. Patrick Chung was a Patriots player that obviously also has an ownership stake through the New England Free Jacks. But hey, it's always cool to see that the MLR is getting recognized on a bigger stage, and hey, hopefully that helps a little bit. But all right, you want to shift over to a top 10 breakdown here? Let's start these fantasy ranking reveal that we're going to start doing throughout the entirety of this offseason. Should be pretty good, and it's going to give people a little bit of a taste of what the 2023 season was really like for some of our fantasy managers when it comes to the players that brought them either to a fantasy championship, close to a fantasy championship, or not close at all. Had both of those here on the show. Matt Yee, Devin Vanderpool, two different stories here.
I didn't bring it up, Van.
For a 2023 season. But let's get into it, and let's talk about some of these top 10 players. And the way that we thought we'd go through this is we're going to reveal here, and we'll bring the graphics on the screen here. We'll reveal the 10 to 6 first, go through that, and then we'll reveal our top 5. So let's bring it up here. Let's start off with our 10th through 6 players here in the 2023 season. Thomas Awake at 10th, Joel Hodgson at 9th, Paula Bellicana at 8th, Vian Conradi at 7, Caleb McEnany at 6. So those are our first 5 players in that top 10. Pretty interesting. I mean, again, you look at some of the players where these were drafted at, you look at some of the positional breakdowns of these players, the amount of points they're being scored. And again, this is all based on the new point system that we used in this 2023 season. Some nice, interesting tidbits here. Any surprises there in that 10 to 6 range there that came out to you?
Nope. 2 Utah players sounds about right to me.
I was going to say, you got to be pretty happy for that old Joel.
That's right,
Joel
buddy.
Right there.
That's right.
But I mean, I think for me, the big one was Thomas Owaki. I mean, we saw him come in halfway through last season from Auckland, and he didn't have that much of an impact. I mean, he looked good at times, but honestly, some of the times watching him, there was something left to be desired. But, you saw him this year, and you saw him in that San Diego offense, and you just saw a guy who was a try-scoring machine, was able to create something out of nothing, was always in the right spot, was always able to kind of use his footwork in order to get the ball in the try zone. And for me, I mean, that's a guy that I did not expect to see in the top 10, especially when you look at the guys that are out of the top 10 in that back 3 position. Definitely a guy that I did not expect to see there.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, out of the entire top 10 that we had here, off of this 2023 season, Thomas Awake was the only one that went undrafted in our Fantasy Ruckers League draft, which is interesting. And in hindsight, it's 2020, right? Because you look at the season that he had last year in terms of that half that he played. There were points where he was tearing it up, and when you look back, the signs were there that he may have a pretty big impact here in 2023. Started every single match in the 2023 season. And then you look at the way he closed out the season. If you had this guy on your team for the fantasy playoffs, he was taking you to a championship. I mean, 20.5 fantasy points in week 15, 24.2 in week 16, 21 in week 17. Finishes the season off with back-to-back games with 2 tries, and he had 9 on the season as a whole. He did have a little bit of a stretch there between weeks 12 and 15 where he didn't play. But man, yeah, Thomas Awake, I was thinking about kind of steals of the season here, and he's got to be one of them in terms of just the amount of fantasy impact he had this season, and where you were able to get him at in terms of picking him up off the waiver wire and having that. He only had 3 matches, and 2 of them were at the start of the season where he scored below 10 fantasy points. Every other week that he played and started in was scoring at least above 12 fantasy points, which is pretty crazy to think about. But yeah, and then, I mean, you look at some of the other guys, I mean, pretty interesting. Caleb McEnany drafted in the 6th round, Vian Conradi the 5th round, Paula Bellicana the 7th round, Joel Hodgson the 3rd round. So you look at that the bottom half of that top 10, no one in that first round is sneaking up in there, which is pretty crazy to think about. Was something that stood out to me as well. And then, yeah, it's pretty interesting to see. All right, let's reveal now the top 5 rankings here for the 2023 season. Dan Creel at the number 5 spot, JP Duplessis, our sole player who was drafted in the first round that made it into the top 10. Lionel Futi, Nate Oxberger, and Joe Mono. So, I mean, you look at that top 5. Yeah, these were all guys that were fantasy impact players all season long. We've talked about Nate Oxberger a whole bunch this season. Joe Mono, talked about him a lot too. Obviously, Futi had those games that, were absolute weeks, those hat-trick weeks that he was able to score. JP Duplessis, he was a stud from the get-go. And Dan Creel, he was kind of that guy that we talked about, was kind of under the radar, but ends up cracking the top 5. So you look at that top 5, what are thoughts over that and things that kind of stuck out to you there?
Joe Mono.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, what was he taking?
You love to see 3 Utah guys up in that top 10.
That's right. When was Joe Mono taken in the draft?
Joe Mono, I think he was in the 9th round.
Steal the draft. Him and Nate Oxberger. Nate was taken pretty late too, wasn't he? 7th round.
5th round. Last pick of the 5th round.
Never mind. Joe Mono's even that much more impressive than. Like the guy came out of nowhere. It looked like an absolute beast.
Yeah.
3-try performance in week 6. Like just a monster year for the guy.
Yeah. I mean, he killed it and honestly came out of nowhere.
And highlight reel too. Not just like, just a nice steal or something. He was putting jukes on people, breaking ankles. He deserves to be the first. Steal the draft.
Yeah, and honestly, nobody would have predicted it from the start of the season. I mean, maybe Rugby Morning might say that he predicted it, but
fair enough.
We all know that he didn't. But I think the one that I'm probably most impressed with was Inafuti. I mean, the guy started off the season not even in that starting lineup.
Mm-hmm.
He was stuck behind Connor Mooneyham in a team that had a pretty good back 3. And he gets on at half and he has an unreal performance in one of the first few games early on in the season. And he just solidified that starting role for the rest of the season. And he was unreal. And he showed, not just pace and not just footwork, but also power. I mean, the guy was an absolute beast and he was fun to watch. And for me, I thought that he was honestly the surprising one in this top 5. Even though I didn't see it coming from Joe Mono, but seeing the way that Inafuti did it, I think that was pretty impressive this year.
Yeah, I mean, the guy was drafted in the the late second last round of our draft, round 14, 8th pick. So yeah, he was definitely a steal as well.
Yeah, and I mean, and you look at the first 2 games. Like I'm just looking at some of his stats. You look at the first 2 games, 18 minutes, 19 minutes, 2 fantasy points, 0.3 fantasy points. And then next thing you know, right after that, he gets on at half. Right. He puts in a 43-minute shift, 12 fantasy points. All right. From there on, he basically starts the rest of the season and puts up double digits almost every week. So,
but that being said, too, you can appreciate good coaching there to realize, you go with the hot hand, not just a name, and you put him in and, kills it the rest of the season.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. And I know, Matt, your team was a benefactor of some of these top 5 players. I mean, you had Nate Oxberger, you had JP Duplessis. So obviously you're reaping the benefits. So then now that we shift over the conversation to kind of looking at, let me mention first, Joe Mono, it wasn't really even that close between Joe Mono and Nate Oxberger. They really were the 2 sole leaders of the year. Joe Mono scoring 246.7 fantasy points, so that was our high this year. And then Nate Oxberger 228.7 fantasy points. So even Joe Mono beating him by almost 20 fantasy points, which is pretty crazy. And then everyone else kind of bunches up after that. But now when you look at that entire top 10, you look down the list and you kind of look at some of the positional breakdowns. You start to see some pretty interesting things. I mean, out of the top 10, 6 of them were back 3 players. 2 of them were centers, and you have a back rower in Vian Conradi, the sole back rower there in the top 10, and then you also have a fly half in Joel Hodgson. So when I see something like that, it is interesting because you're starting to see some positions, and we're compare it to last year's rankings with our old stats just shortly here. But it's nice to see a little bit of a mix of some other players, positional players starting to come in. You're seeing a little bit more value in the center position. You're seeing a little bit more value in some of the players and the type of players in terms of guys who gain meters and things like that. One big note before we compare it is that, we only had 1 fly half in Joel Hodgson make it top 10 last year. Our top 10 was riddled with fly halves and guys who were kicking. So it is interesting there. So when you look at that as a whole, guys, what kind of stands out to you in terms of kind of what our top 10 looks in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, like for me, from my perspective, this is kind of what shows what positions have a guy that is just above the rest. At least looking at last season, right? Like you look at Joel Hodgson. Even when you look at one of the top players of the year, I would say Jason Potros, right? I think he was potentially player of the year.
He was player
Uh,
of the year.
so you look at player of the year, Jason Potros, and Joel Hodgson is still sitting 20 points ahead of him, right? You look at Vian Conradi, right? The only back row in the top 10. And you look at the next back row is Adrian Boyson with 162 points, which is almost 30 points below. And you just start to see that some of these positions are going to have one guy who is just above the rest. And having that guy at that position, having a Vian Conradi, having a Joel Hodgson, it just it makes them so much more valuable in the upcoming draft. And that's kind of the way that I look at this. When you look at like a back three, it's like, hey, I can get Joe Mano, I can get Oxberger, I can get Inafuti. I'll be pretty happy with all three.
Yeah.
I mean, the argument there though is that I feel like, I mean, I wouldn't put Futi in there necessarily, but man, Joe Mano and Nate Oxberg were so far ahead of everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
So far ahead. I mean, I think I would, my back three argument, I think I agree with you there, Matt, is that the back three position, you can fill and find guys who are going to perform with you on a week. But those two guys, Joe Mano and Nate Oxberger, it was crazy. And it's going to be hard to predict because, again, we didn't predict that it was going to be those guys this season at all. And again, that just kind of reflects the volatility of that back three position. And maybe with these stats, there'll be more reflection into next year and people have a little bit more knowledge when they're drafting their fantasy teams heading into 2024. But again, these two guys are there. But I do agree with you, Matt, that it has highlighted that there are some guys here that are absolute studs when it comes to Vian Conradi, Joel Hodgson, and then JP Duplessis and Dan Creel. Pretty impressive stuff. But I think what's going to make the picture even clearer here, guys, is if I throw up the top 10 rankings that we had last season. So I bring them up. And obviously, again, like we mentioned, this is the rankings based off of the stats that we used last season. So when we were only counting the try scored and the try meters, it was a completely different landscape in terms of fantasy scoring. So bring up the top 10. When we go down the list, we got Bodine Waka, Ed Fido, Joe Peterson, AJ Alatimu, William Talataina, Mitch Wilson, Reichert Hadding, Renata Roberts Tanana, Sam Malcolm, and Penny Lasaka. When I look at these two lists here and these two top 10s, there are a lot of things that are different. But then I feel like there are also a lot of things that are the same that I thought was going to be quite drastically changed, which wasn't as different as I thought it would. The first thing that I came up with, and you guys tell me your thoughts here, is that based on the number of back three players that are still in our top 10, it is clear to me that tries are still king. Try scorers is what is going to win you fantasy championships.
Right, as it should be, though.
We talked about heading into the season that meters gained was going to get you kind of maybe a little bit closer to that. But look at the number of back three players that got in there. All of them were try scorers. The only one that I'd maybe argue was Caleb McEnany, who is just a try meter, a meter eater, as James Dealey would say. But Joe Mano, try scorer. Nate Oxberger, try scorer. Lionel Foudy, try scorer. Paula Bellicana was a try scorer. Thomas Awake, try scorer. Like, these are the guys that are hitting the top 10 because they find the end zone. And that is still something that is very abundantly clear to me. Now, with that being said, it's not going to be easy to find these try scorers in these fantasy. It's very volatile, and you never know. You don't have Joe Manos that are going to be basically scoring a try every single match. But when you get your hands on one of these guys that does do that, it's a massive advantage, and those are the guys that are going to break the top 10. Matt, it seems like you kind of disagree with that.
I think it's fair and a valid point. I think the tries are definitely a big thing, but I think what it showed to me is that, we expected a move from, the back three, or if you're expecting a change from the back three to being out of the top 10, I just don't think it was ever realistic. I mean, our league values, yes, try scoring, but also meters gained, right? Like, both of those two things, and the one position that is able to get both of them at the same time at a high quantity all the time is back three. So it's just going to be a hard time unless you really manipulate the scoring and really make it either forward heavy or, kind of, I guess like more workhorse heavy, like less pretty. Um, it's kind of it's going to be hard. Like I think it's just something that whatever we do to it, we're going to have to accept that back three is always going to be the highest scoring thing, just like kind of like in fantasy football where there's always those positions.
Yeah, well, but to be fair in that argument, the excitement comes from the try.
Yeah.
When you watch these sports, if we inevitably want to get to the point where, you're watching the game, you get super excited because your guy knocked off a big try. You get excited by that through the amount of fantasy points that are gotten by that. So, if your guy went off a game and then all of a sudden you just realize that a front row guy had 17 tackles and he, amounted to the same, you sit there and go, wow, watching the game, it didn't feel like that. And that's what it has to be. Fantasy has to relate to the game when you watch it, and then you could at the end of it be like, that guy had a day. And it sucks for the position, but it is what it is. And for fantasy to be relevant with the sport, the exciting moments have to amount to good points. Like it just has to be that way.
Now, I do want to clarify and say that I'm not saying that I expected that back three players were going to get kicked out of it. All I'm saying is that a back three player who does not score tries is not making the top 10.
Mm-hmm.
Like tries, if you score tries, that you have to score tries to make it a significant piece in this top 10. All the guys that are on this list scored tries.
For me, if you look at last year, look at all the kicker eligibility. That's what was huge too.
Right.
This year we've deviated from that, where it's kickers. Kickers. Not saying it was easy points, but it's not points that were relatively gained by a dominance of play. And I agree, getting away from that was the best thing we could have done. Similar to, I don't want to like get into it, but with football, a quarterback's going to get more opportunity for more points. So then, you have to make it relative. So I think we did a good job of making it so, the quarterback, the kicker, isn't just surpassing everyone just based off of just their ability to be in those positions all the time.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that'll be a point that we'll touch on. But like, just to ground off the whole back three thing is that I think what our scoring did make it though, and difference from last year to this year, is that you can make the top 10 without tries as a back three. You can be a Caleb McEnany and have those exceptional meters gained and make the top 10 and be one of those guys that, hey, look, I don't need the tries, but I can still make it in here.
Yeah, I think he only got 5 tries. I think you're right. He didn't score very many.
And last year that was impossible. And last year we would never see McEnany up there.
Yeah.
But this year we got to see his impact. We got to understand his impact. And we see that even without the tries, he has a top 10 fantasy impact. And I think, Ryan, to your point, yes, it's very hard to make the top 10, but what the scoring has done and what the comparison between last year and this year is it's possible now. You can do that.
It is. I get that. And that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that it's not possible to get in there, but I guess my point being is that you're not winning a fantasy championship with 15 Caleb McEnany's.
Sure.
You need a Joe Mono and a Nate Osper. Yes, Caleb McEnany can sneak in our top 10 with the new scoring that we have. But to me, what this shows is, like I said at the beginning, tries are still king. You're going to, and to your point, Vandy, I think that is a good thing, is that we're
you need it to be like that. It has to relate like that.
So, and then again, I guess
conversions are king.
I guess another thing that we'll shift on over to, with Vandy just alluded to there, which I think is very good that we moved away from, is the fact that we do not have this high concentration of kickers in our top 10 who were scoring the majority of our points in last season.
Yep.
You look at Bodine Waka, Joe Peterson, AJ Alatimu, even William Tantan, I believe, took kicking opportunities at some points in there. Sam Malcolm is in there too. So we essentially removed that, which I do like. I mean, have guys who were money, and Matt, we talked about throughout the season. Joel Hodgson was absolutely clutch at kicking, and that's why he was able to crack the bottom of that top 10. But if you're not a Joel Hodgson, you're just being a quote unquote average kicker or a above average kicker. It's not automatically giving you the top 10 spot. So it was good to see that we're balancing out those kicking points with other factors such as meters gained, tackles, and things like that. And I will say too, William Talatana obviously cracked the top 10 last season. I think a lot of that was due to the tries that he was scoring. It was nice to see JP Duplessis, Dan Creel both in that top 10, adding a little bit more centers having a little bit more weight, which goes to your argument, Matt, which is now we are rewarding guys
Yep.
who are not necessarily just scoring tries, but also who are able to supplement that with tackles and with meters gained, which again, these center positions is probably good at. What I was surprised at though was we only got again one back row player in Vian Conradi. I thought there would be more of them. I thought based on the meters gained that they tend to get sometimes, the more tackles that they tend to get, I thought that was going to be a little bit more of a shift, but not something that we necessarily saw. But I will say where it makes it clear is that, Matt, you mentioned it. You saw Conrad Arura in there, or I mean, not Conrad Arura, Adrian Boyson in there. After Vian Conradi, the back row players that came in next were Adrian Boyson, Jamison Fanana-Schultz, and Charles Elton, and they were in the 18, 19, 20 spot. Last year, in our top back row players, Reichert Hadding, right, who had a stellar season, was at that 7th spot. The next back row player to come in didn't come in until 30.
Well,
yeah,
damn.
Right.
Yeah,
so that
and Reichert probably would have been up there if he didn't get.
I mean, he would have been in there.
He would have been in there
if he didn't have the needle incident. I mean, the shoulder incident. Shoulder incident. Yeah.
Wasn't it knee or shoulder?
Needle.
You guys are ridiculous.
Terrible. But I mean, yeah, I'm interested as well. With the whole back row thing, to Vanny's point, Reichert Hadding, I think, would be in that top 10 if he played a full season. But for me, I think you bring up the centers, and I think the centers was the position that honestly gained the most from this.
Yep.
Because the centers finally got rewarded for the work that they do of ball carry.
Who was the top center last year, Ryan?
The top center last year was William Talatina. But again, like I said, a lot of that was had the kicking and also scored a whole bunch of tries as well, I believe.
Yeah, and he also played on the wing.
8 tries, yeah.
Yeah, he definitely played on the wing at times too. And I mean, I just think that the centers finally got rewarded for the work that they do as well.
Yeah.
Like you see that the hard work that they're doing in terms of taking the ball up. You saw the way that Dan Krill, you saw the way that JP Duplessis, these guys are taking the ball. You saw the way that Billy Meeks this year even did it, even though he was like 12th in the rankings. But you look at these guys, and I mean, single digit tries, around 5 tries each. Nice one, Vanny. Around 5 tries each. And you look at them, but they're still sitting up there in the top 10, top 12, and they're finally being rewarded for the work that they do. And I think that is just another way to Vanny that you say, the excitement, the way you want to see guys break the line, the way you want to see guys run it straight at people.
Yep.
That's what they're getting rewarded for, and that's what our fantasy points are clearly shifting towards when you compare the two top 10.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I will say though, I did think, and I think this is reflected in our conversation that we had at the start of the season, or before the season even started, based on our predictions, which we'll obviously get into more as we continue to go through these rankings, is that I did think that we were going to have a little bit more center up there and a little bit more back row player. I did not think that there'd be as many back threes as there was.
Same thing with Billy Meeks though, right? Like if he played a full season, I bet you he's in that top 10.
Sure.
So there's some like and then you push Thomas Iwaki out, right? You get a bit more centers in there, maybe even Mika Cruz comes pretty close too, right? Like,
right.
So I think there's a lot of guys around that top 10 where you could make an argument like, hey, if this happened in the season, our top 10 could be a completely different makeup.
Yeah. That's true.
But pretty interesting to break that down again. Just some spectacular seasons from some players that obviously made it a whole bunch of fun this fantasy season. Joe Mono, Nate Oxberger, some to name a couple, been fantastic. It's interesting kind of looking back at last year's rankings and comparing that because it's obviously a completely different game now.
And before we kind of close it all out, but to put you guys on the spot, is there somebody that you're surprised to not see in this top 10 this year? Like who is the biggest surprise for you that you don't see in the top 10 this year?
Honestly,
that I thought without seeing the numbers that I would have thought, or that maybe at the start of the season should have been up here.
Ed Fido.
I mean, no, just looking at the numbers now, like saying like, wow, I can't believe this guy didn't make it. I thought that he would have been a for sure pick in the top 10 if we're looking at the start of the season. So yeah, I guess
after coming into rugby last year and seeing Ed Fido, I thought that guy was the scariest rugby player I've ever seen. I was like, this guy, if you caught him in a back alley, you just turn the hell away and you go home. Like that guy's terrifying. And not see him here is wild to me. Wild.
Yeah. No, I'd agree. That'd probably be the player that I pick. I mean, he was picked number 1 overall in our fantasy draft.
Rightfully so too.
If you had told me at the start of the season that Andrew Coe would be finishing ahead of Ed Fido on Rugby New York, or excuse me, the New York Ironworkers,
Same thing.
I definitely wouldn't have predicted that. But
I would have. That's why I picked.
I just wanted to see if we're all on the same page, because I mean that's the one that I looked at the end of the season,
100%.
and that I looked at throughout the season, and like, is this guy ever going to crack the top 10? Is he ever going to be up here? And I mean, that was something that we were kind of waiting to happen. And he just had a few breakout games, but never really could keep it consistent. And
yeah.
Well, really, it's kind of like Mikey Teo last year.
Yeah.
The year before we played, Mikey Teo was I think the try leader. And then I don't even think he finished top 20 last year.
I mean, hey, this year he's one of those guys that kind of like McEnany. It's like, he benefited from having those meters gained, right? And it showed, and we see him in what?
And Teo, if you listen to this, sorry for calling you 40, man.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, Mike Teo in the 13th in the rankings there. So interesting
Ed Fido
that was wild to me,
crazy.
Man. That was the scariest dude I ever seen on a rugby pitch.
He doesn't care about no top 10. He's on to bigger, better things with Samoa going into the World Cup. So, you know,
actually, I take that back. Mao Nanu, when Ryan used to show me all black clips of him, was the scariest dude I've ever seen on the rugby pitch. But Ed Fido, you're right up there too.
But yeah, no, always interesting to kind of break it down. Again, though that is our top 10. Cool to kind of look back at our 10 last year. But yeah, this is just the start. Throughout the entirety of this offseason, we are going to be breaking down our top players from the 2023 year. Next week, it starts with the front row players that we're going to be discussing about and talking and breaking down. Always interesting to talk about the big boys there, because obviously there's been a differing landscape in terms of the points that they're scoring, based definitely from last year to this year, and kind of there's always been that controversy in terms of the value that they have in fantasy, just because it's always hard to predict on who's going to score the tries, how many minutes they're going to play, and who's making the tackles. And there's obviously some outliers in terms of players that you're going to see in that top that top list for the front row position, which would be interesting, which we'll get into next week.
And the people are just going to see just how brutal we were this year at picking our preseason top 5s.
That is true.
Either we're brutal or literally, you know, that's rugby. Anything can happen in fantasy rugby.
Again, and I think that's completely reflected in the fact that JP Duplessis was the only player selected in our first round that made it into our top 10. Crazy to think.
Pick bus.
All right. Well, hey, we're super excited to keep the content flowing here this entire offseason long. The Major League Rugby season may be over, but the fantasy preparation for 2024 never stops.
Never stops.
So we're gonna keep that going here. Again, next week we continue with the front row players, and we're gonna go through every single position, talk about the top players, compare them to our predictions, and break down what we think this means as we continue to navigate this landscape, this ever-changing landscape of fantasy rugby in the MLR. Any final thoughts about anything that we talked about today, guys, in terms of the news that we broke down, which was a whole bunch of it, or the top 10 overall players that we saw from 2023?
I mean, you know, I think we got a lot coming up here. You know, I have a feeling, I have this inkling in my bones. This offseason is going to be a little bit of an interesting one. Seems like it's already gotten off to a hot start. And, you know, I can't wait for more to come. And boy, whenever this new team comes up, whenever this LA, wherever this team shows up, you know that I'm going to give it a.
You're going to give
it a what?
Give it hell.
Oh, I didn't hear that. I was like, give it what?
Give it what? What do you say?
Imagine where you keep saying LA and it ends up in like Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Well, Brian Ray's never wrong. So.
Ooh, fair enough.
We got that. We got the inside sources, and hey, we're a reliable source too. So we said on the show, so it's got
apparently so.
Apparently so.
Apparently, I think it's just our website.
Just remember, don't take anything I say too seriously.
That's right. All right. Well, hey, for Matt Yee, for Devin Vanderpool, this is the Fantasy Ruckers show. Got through our top 10 front rower players next week. It's going to be a good one. Stay tuned all off season long for all your fantasy MLR content. We'll see you next week.
Let's go.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.